From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of the Capital Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Jake Klein, Media Producer at the Capital Research Center, and I'll be moderating this podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. So yesterday, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Steve, you were in the audience for that at the White House. This is a big win for us. I think we've been pushing for this as an organization for a long time. And we have a video with you online as well that you can watch on our YouTube channel explaining why the Paris Climate Accord was a bad idea in longer detail. We'll get into some of that here as well as a very thorough article from you. So just to give us some brief information now, what was/is for other countries the Paris Climate Accord?
Yeah, it was. By the way, I wrote my long piece on this was entitled "We Won't Always Have Paris," and I was sort of biting my fingernails a little bit until we had a decision from the president. I didn't want to be proven wrong, and I was very glad to be proven right in this case because this is something that's very important for our country and the world. The Paris Climate Treaty, and it is a treaty, was something that, well, it's also not a treaty, but that's something we can talk about later. It was something that was developed through a process that began decades ago. It was spearheaded by the United Nations and environmental organizations to address the issue of climate change, as they would say now. Back then it was global warming, and of course they changed their phraseology. And they created a process that led to what was called the Rio Treaty, which was adopted at the Earth Summit back in 1992. And this was a thing where the United States was just raked over the coals for its evil role in evil capitalism in destroying the planet. And a treaty was agreed to that was a treaty to make future treaties. And this was approved by the United States Senate on a voice vote as people were headed out the door to go campaign for re-election. And that was not a matter of controversy. Nobody voted against it because it was just a treaty to get together and make future treaties. And specifically, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had provided an attachment to the Senate vote, you might say, that said this is not to be taken as an agreement that binds the United States to anything other than to get together and negotiate in the future. So that's what happened, and then time passes. There is the Kyoto Agreement, which was an international agreement supposedly to fight climate change or global warming, that the United States did not participate in. And in fact, it was negotiated by the Clinton administration. Al Gore was our signatory, but it was never submitted to the Senate for a vote. And therefore, at the time, it was understood that if you didn't submit a treaty to the Senate and the Senate didn't pass it by a 2/3 vote, that it wasn't a treaty that bound us. And that was understood at the time, but time passed. President George W. Bush came in. He withdrew us from the treaty, did not formally withdraw from the treaty, so it was just sort of sitting there the whole time. But he didn't submit it for a vote in the Senate and didn't follow the provisions. So then another treaty was negotiated, and this was the Paris Treaty. And everybody wanted to take advantage of the fact that the U.S. administration was run by President Obama, who is a big global warming guy. And they got together, and this was actually described. Stephen Chu, who was the Secretary of Energy in the first part of the Obama administration, actually gave an interview to Wired magazine, and he described it as a process where we, the United States, would get together with China. By that he means communist China. And we would bully the rest of the world into this agreement. He said it's like a high school movie. Once the jocks and the nerds unite for a common cause, everyone falls in line, and that was the idea. And in fact, the rest of the world did fall in line, partly because we offered hundreds of billions of dollars in money from the developed countries, so-called the more successful countries financially, to go to the poorer countries. So the poorer countries were quick to get in. They also wanted to be there for the big conference that was to be held to determine how the rules would work on this. And in order to do that, you had to be a participant in the treaty. So this was actually put together, approved by the countries of the world in record time. There's nothing like this. It was approved years before people projected that it would be approved. And the reason was they had a deadline. And that deadline was the American presidential election. And in fact, it went into force on, get this, November 4th, 2016. 4 days before Americans would have their say on what they thought about this treaty and vote and have a chance to vote and might vote for Donald Trump, who had promised to pull us out of the treaty in May of 2016. So they deliberately scheduled this thing to get around the American democracy by ramming it through before the American people could have their say. And Donald Trump had promised to get rid of it. Then when he unexpectedly wins the election, everyone is thrown into a tizzy. There's a lot of deliberation at the White House. And then finally we end up with the situation yesterday where the president announced that he was pulling us out of this agreement. Specifically, what it does is it has the countries of the world make unenforceable and in some cases impossible promises. By that I mean there are some countries that have promised to get rid of more than 100% of their carbon emissions on carbon dioxide, which of course is an invisible gas that's harmless to humans, but that is blamed by activists for global warming, which they now call climate change, and that the United States would, have a reduction that would be equal to 26%, I believe, below the 2005 levels. I don't want to get into the weeds on this, because these are basically just numbers. But this was to provide justification for the Obama administration policies to drive up the cost of electricity for Americans and make energy expensive otherwise. Remember, the president admitted in the 2008 campaign, he admitted in an interview with newspaper editorial staff people that under his plan, he said electricity prices would necessarily skyrocket. That was his terminology. And this was part of that. And meanwhile, each country would get to come up with its own promise. And this would be unenforceable. Each country would get to come up with its own method for deciding whether it had kept its promise. There were actually some poor countries that had to outsource all of this because they had no idea. When you have South Sudan, for example, is a country with 10 million people, but outside the capital city, there's one paved road. Do you think they have lots of people running around keeping track of everyone's carbon footprint? Obviously not. So they had to, countries like that had to outsource this. So there's like a little industry of people doing these measurements and then coming up with a plan for them because they don't really have the capacity to come up with a plan. The main thing was to transfer money to these other countries. There's supposed to be a green climate fund, $100 billion a year, which would go to the so-called developing world, that is to say to the kleptocrats and dictators in those countries to spend as they will. And this money, for example, India said, well, we won't approve this treaty unless we get a promise of $2.5 trillion. And that was their requirement for getting it. And so, of course, India was in favor of it. People said, well, why would India be in favor of it? Because they're going to be one of the countries that has the biggest increase in carbon emissions. Well, they're going to get a lot of money out of it, and money's going to go to the communist Chinese who have this huge economy. So,
Steve, before we go further, let's deal with a question that an issue that has been bugging me quite a bit. You have the statement. Even President Trump was infelicitous in his use of language yesterday, saying that the United States was withdrawing, or he was withdrawing the United States from this Paris Climate Accord. But according to a Northwestern University School of Law professor, Eugene Kontorovich, he wrote in the Washington Post opinion section yesterday, Trump is not quitting the Paris Accord. The United States was never in it in the first place. What he should have said at the press availability was that the United States never properly joined the accord. It's a treaty that requires the advice and consent of the Senate. Instead, President Barack Obama chose to adopt, in quote marks, it with an executive order last September. So really, it was just I guess he's arguing that it was just a declaration that we're not part of this treaty, and it is to be followed up with some kind of executive action in which he formalizes that. Could we go over the without making it too boring? Could we just go over the legal niceties here?
Yeah, basically it's this.
And you are a lawyer in theory.
Yes, and a political scientist and other things. The president can make an agreement with another country that affects that president, and he or she could always pull out of such an agreement, but you would have the moral authority, the legal, there would be the expectation that this would be kept. And obviously things happen like wars where people break all sorts of agreements, but generally speaking, you would keep those agreements to the best of your ability because you're depending on other countries to keep their agreements. This particular treaty, and the reason I said it's a treaty, it's not a treaty, is it's a treaty for everywhere else in the world, but then they pretend it's not a treaty for the United States. And the reason they do that is because it's in the Constitution, very specifically. Alexander Hamilton wrote about this in the Federalist Papers, why this was so important, that the Senate approve a treaty by a 2/3 vote. And the closest thing we have to a Senate vote on this, we have two instances that you might look at and say, well, has the Senate ever approved anything like this? 5 years after that earlier agreement I told you about, where the Senate did approve a treaty to make treaties in the future, there was a vote called on the Byrd-Hagel resolution, and that was the former Democratic leader of the Senate and the future cabinet member, defense secretary under the Obama administration. He was a Republican, but a moderate Republican, and so not crazy right wingers, and they
like you and me.
And they proposed that we specifically say we will not be a party. Do not expect that because of some previous vote that we've taken that this means we're a party. We will not be a party to any treaty that treats the United States or the developing world in general differently from other countries, which this does, or that would harm the economy of the United States, which this does.
So is it fair to say, Dr. Allen, that it is a treaty, but that the U.S. U.S. law doesn't recognize it as a treaty because binding on the United States because it wasn't formally ratified by the U.S. by a 2/3 vote in the affirmative of the U.S. Senate? Is that correct? Like a treaty can exist without us being a party to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Other countries can bind themselves with treaties among themselves, but the Byrd-Hagel resolution, by the way, passed 95-0. 95-0, not to ever approve a treaty like this. And then, of course, the Obama people, the Obama and the Democrats, had a 60-vote majority in the Senate and early in the days of the Obama administration, and never brought this thing up. And obviously, it wouldn't pass now because you need a 2/3 vote, and it's unlikely the thing would even get a majority vote, much less a 2/3 vote. So it's clear there's no prospect for anything like this ever getting through the U.S. Senate. And yet the Constitution says we're not a party to a treaty unless it does go through the U.S. Senate with a 2/3 vote. So what happened was President Obama just sort of certifies that the United States has ratified this treaty. And this fiction, legal fiction, as we call it, was accepted by the people on the other side because in order for the treaty to go into force, you had to have 55 countries with 55% of the total emissions. And without the United States, that just wasn't going to happen. So in order for the thing to exist, they had to pretend that it had been ratified. And that's what these people are. They're con artists. They're bureaucrats whose power depends on this kind of thing. And that's what they do. So you're absolutely right on that.
So obviously, we think that this was a good idea, but concretely, what benefits do you see this having for America?
Well, if this had continued, here's what would have happened. Everyone talks about this as a non-binding agreement. We're just making a promise. We don't have to keep it. And that's true for every country that I know of other than the United States. I don't know of any country that has an independent part of the government that can order the other part of the government, the executive part, to do things. But we have that here, and we're seeing that with the immigration fight, the temporary ban from certain terrorist hotspots. We're seeing that where the judges come in and they say, well, we're not going to let you do that. We don't like your politics on that. And very specifically, they said, we don't like your politics on that. And so this would be a basis for judges to come in and say, we have a treaty obligation. And that would certainly be that. If we had allowed this to go through, it would have set the precedent, not only for this, but other situations where a president just declares that a treaty has been ratified without actually going through the constitutional process. But you would have had judges enforcing this. You would have had bureaucrats operating on the premise that it as if it had been approved. And you can see that. Look at the reaction. People see this as almost a religious thing. And as I pointed out, I wrote a long piece on this that's on our website. When they were rushing to get this through, they didn't know Donald Trump was going to be elected. Of course, he was always a possibility, but not. The odds were not in his favor.
But then the nightmare became a reality.
But why did they rush? Why were they so crazy to get this thing done by November 4th? If they weren't afraid that much of Trump, well, they were a little bit. But mainly it was the Republican Congress, but also they wanted to give cover to President Hillary Clinton if she were elected. Because think about it. She'd be able to say, look, guys, you Pennsylvania coal miners, I really feel sorry for you, and you shouldn't vote against me because I love you. But I'm just stuck. I have to follow the Paris Treaty, and the Paris Treaty says I have to do certain things that basically involve shutting down the coal industry. So I'm really, really sorry, but it's not my fault. And it was to provide cover for Hillary.
You better just go back to clinging to your guns and religion.
Exactly. So there's so much. This thing is basically politics. It's people covering themselves, making it look like they're environmental crusaders. There's one scientific projection that was based on everybody fulfilling their obligations, which is hilarious because there have been other climate agreements and nobody kept the agreements. There weren't countries. The only countries that ever kept agreements to cut down on the green, on particularly carbon dioxide, were in situations where it was happening naturally. I mean, we've had an 18% decrease in the United States. And it's because of fracking, which led to this explosion of use in natural gas, which the Obama administration fought tooth and nail against. So the all the environmentalists, they're all against the very things that are making things better from their perspective.
So you mentioned in there that this deal was going to shut down the coal industry. A lot of what I've read in the media has said that the coal industry has been dying anyway. This isn't going to do anything to bring back the coal industry. And just talking about jobs more broadly, 25 major U.S. companies, including Apple, Facebook, and Google, urged President Trump not to exit the accord, claiming the Paris Agreement creates jobs and growth by, quote, expanding markets for innovative clean technologies, as opposed to coal. Even oil companies such as Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, and BP backed the accord. So how can we and the president claim that backing out of the accord will help the economy?
Well, you can tell what they're up to when they use misleading language. They talk about clean energy. Well, of course, we're talking about carbon dioxide, which is invisible, harmless to humans. And they're basing that on this confusion that people have between black carbon, soot like you'd see in a fireplace, that kind of thing, and carbon monoxide, which people do die from if they get, fall asleep in the garage with the car running or something like that.
Along with dihydrogen monoxide, which is also very dangerous.
Right, and we've seen that where you have people collecting petitions to ban dihydrogen monoxide, and everybody signs it because they think it's a dangerous chemical, and it is dangerous. It's water, and people drown in water. But anyway, the companies that you're talking about, I mean, they're the worst of the worst. The most irresponsible, extreme. They have the most extremist politics. That's why we're so concerned about these folks having their control of the social network universe. Google and Facebook, Microsoft and Apple, and then others like ExxonMobil. And of course, ExxonMobil, my theory, and no one has really come up with a counter to this, is that ExxonMobil changed its position and became a crusader for the global warming religion. And that they did it because the reason they did it was because they had bought the largest natural gas company in America. And of course, one of the things that you would have happen in a world where you had to restrict carbon emissions would be you would shift from fuels like coal and oil to natural gas, which is much cleaner burning. Of course, they'll come for the natural gas people after that, and you see that with the environmentalists going after fracking. They believe that no carbon-based fuels should be brought out of the ground at this point. That's it, and that would be a danger for the whole world. But anyway, so you have Morgan Stanley, you have the Gap. The Gap is in favor. They were one of the organizations that signed this ad in the New York Times calling on the president to stay
You
in
mean
Paris.
the fashion retailer?
Yes, exactly. And I really care what the Gap has to say about global warming. Tiffany's was in there. Mars Candy was in there. Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Hartford. Look, there are a lot of folks who are they're left-wing corporations. You see that when they participate in boycotts of conservatives for no good reason.
Like Starbucks telling gun owners to drop dead.
Right. And I remember, I covered this 20 years ago, when the public affairs departments in corporations were being targeted by the left for takeover, and they would get their people in there. And I actually attended conferences where someone from the telephone company, for example, would stand in front of a group of liberal activists, left-wing activists, and say, don't think because I'm from a big corporation that I'm not on your side. I'm 100% on your side. And then he'd give his background and to prove it. So that's what you have in a lot of corporate America. The Fortune 500 is, unfortunately, their public affairs departments are overwhelmingly people on the left. And then you have people who wish to profit off of a deal like the Paris deal, like ExxonMobil with its ownership of natural gas.
And like General Electric's Jeffrey Immelt, your classic crony capitalist.
Crony capitalist. And of course, who quit the president's advisory councils over this?
Did he do that along with Elon Musk?
Elon Musk did. Yeah. And of course, Elon Musk is somebody, boy, I tell you, if anybody personifies crony capitalism, it's Elon Musk, who got, as of 2 years ago, according to the Los Angeles Times, $4.9 billion in subsidies and managed to make himself a billionaire. You give me $4.9 billion, I'll make myself a billionaire.
And those were largely
too.
subsidies for green technology, so he's a direct beneficiary of
That's
this
exactly
stuff.
right.
He's the maker of the Tesla automobile, isn't he?
Well, and by the way, battery, think about it. Is there really any benefit to battery-powered cars? Because you're plugging the car into the electric grid, so whatever is used to make the electricity is going to be reflected in what the car uses
I
up.
had one when I was like 4, a little sports car, driving around in the basement at like half a mile an hour on battery power. It was awesome.
And I'm not saying...
don't you put down all electric cars.
Given enough subsidy, given that if you're selling cars for $100,000 each, then
I think this car was about $100 actually.
Yeah. And by the way, let me make a point on this business about, well, all our companies are going to make money by developing this green technology. Well, guess what? What's going to happen is, would have happened if the Paris Treaty had continued as far as U.S. involvement, and that is we're going to invent this stuff, and then the third world countries, the developing countries, will say, okay, now we want it, give it to us. And that's exactly what the Chinese do now. If you operate a country and you have a factory in China, they expect you to turn over your what's called intellectual property, which is your techniques, your technology, and that's exactly what would have happened with this. And you see it with AIDS drugs. You see it with all kinds of things where we spend the money to develop things, and then people in other parts of the world, and understandably, if you're in a country where people live on $1.50 a day, you can see why they wouldn't want to pay for things. But the point is, we're not going to make money off these things when we have to give them away.
And I just wanted to add on this point, it is true that market forces are pushing down the coal industry even without this additional regulatory burden. But it's about the speed with which that's going to happen in part. And there are communities that are really struggling from this industry leaving. And if you speed that up and they don't have the time to adjust and find new jobs, you devastate these communities. And we've been seeing that going on. And yes, renewable energies, even on the market, would be growing. But when you do that out of whack with market forces, when you try and speed that up by giving subsidies and the cost per kilowatt hour of renewable energy is still so much higher, all you're doing is burning up dollars that poor people in this country could be using on things they need, whether it's, getting a mortgage or paying for food or whatever.
You're redistributing wealth
there
according to the dictates of politicians instead of letting people decide with their wallets and their feet how things should be done in our society.
And you see a situation like how it happens in Europe, where you have you pay 3 times the U.S. price for electricity. You have ultra high costs for things like home heating fuel, and as a result, what happens in Britain?
Don't you have $8 or $10 a gallon for gasoline?
Yeah, and
it
by
might
the way,
even be high. It's higher in some.
And
places,
Obama's Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, said that European style pricing for gasoline should be our goal. And at the time he said that, it was before the 2008 election, before he was appointed, but right before. And he said European style prices, that was $8 a gallon at the time. So and in Europe, in Britain particularly, you have people dying of what's called energy poverty. They can't afford to keep their houses warm, and they die by the thousands. And this is widely reported in Britain, and yet people say, well, gosh, that's just the price we have to pay. We got to fight that global warming.
Well, don't people
Climate
also,
change.
when you have the occasional, they don't have heat waves in Western Europe very often, but when they do, you'll have lots of people killed in places like France, in warmer parts of France where they're not, in cooler parts of France where they're not used to high temperatures and they don't have air conditioning. Air conditioning is a luxury only for the rich in those parts. So if you're 85 years old and in poor health and a shut-in and there's a heat wave, you're just going to sit there and roast.
Yeah,
it's not good for people.
And if you're in that part of the world that doesn't have electricity now, you look at satellite images of Africa, and you can see outside of North Africa and South Africa, the vast area in between, you see just blackness mostly, very little light because people aren't on the electric grid, and you can't get the standard of living up to what we expect to live on in this country. We are a rich country, and poor people in this country, I'm not saying there's not poverty, but poor people in this country have it much better off than middle class people in most of the world. And in places where people are living on $1.50 a day or less,
and they burn animal dung to heat their hovels, their huts, which is not good. Which is and there's toxic blowback when they do that.
Yeah, in fact, indoor air pollution from having to use these stoves inside houses is one of the leading causes of lung cancer. In fact, WHO said it was the cause of most of the cases of lung cancer in the world, not smoking, but rather people having to use these stoves because they don't have access to electricity. And who are we to tell these people you're not going to be able to rise up? I understand if the science worked out, you could make a case and you could figure out a system, but this is not it. This is horrible.
And there's statistics out there about climate-related deaths over time and correlating that with the price of energy. And, cheap energy is a huge, huge saver of lives, and it's largely because of these types of places where extreme weather kills people, and if they don't have the energy to protect themselves against it, and these hovels that you're talking about where people, really damage themselves because they can't get more conventional forms of energy that are safer to use. But moving on from this, another major criticism of pulling out of the Accord that has been all over the media is how can the U.S. be trusted by other countries to make international agreements if with changing administrations we're so willing to change course? And I know we went over some of the problems with how this was ratified in America or not ratified, but might you make the argument that the burden is too high, or once a president commits to something, you just got to stick with it? Because a number of foreign leaders have expressed a reduction of their trust in the United States, most notably Germany's Angela Merkel. And what is this going to mean for U.S. global influence?
Yeah, Angela Merkel, who's messed things up so badly in Germany that they're paying people to build coal-fired power plants to make up for the deficit in energy caused by the transfer over to so-called renewables. I mean, it's a complete mess. And look, the United States has always been the target of all of this. Everybody said that. This was to remake the world, to create, as the head of the UN panel behind this said, to remake the world economy. This is our chance to remake it for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. And of course, you had people like Van Jones, who was Obama's green jobs czar early in the administration, who said that the whole idea of green capitalism was to move away from capitalism and eventually get to a system that's not capitalism at all. And sort of your midpoint is green capitalism.
Right. And he's an admitted communist, so we know where he's coming from.
So my point is that, they made a deal with Barack Obama. They made a deal with Barack Obama knowing that an election was coming up. And it was with Barack Obama only, and they knew his term was expiring. And to those who say, well, we should let people know what the rules are for us getting into an international agreement. Maybe we should write that down in something, and then like publicly, publish it, put it out on the web, print it up in little books, and we could call it, I don't know, the U.S. Constitution. How about that? And then people, I know it's a real burden to make people in Germany and France and Britain, look up a copy of the U.S. Constitution, but maybe we should make that a requirement so they understand that when they're dealing with us, if they want to do a treaty, it has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate.
Okay, any final thoughts on this topic?
It's a terrible agreement, and it's wonderful that President Trump is not going to honor it. This is a great victory for economic freedom and for self-determination of the people of the United States.
This is a treaty that's not a treaty, that's binding, but it's not binding. It affects the United States, which has ratified it, but except that it hasn't ratified it. That's my point. This is all bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo. It's the kind of thing that these people try to impose on us, and thank goodness we're Americans and we don't stand for this kind of nonsense.
Steve, do you want to plug your article on this topic one last time?
I have an article, We Won't Always Have Paris. That's a long version of this. What is this? 12,000 words. I get into all these issues, and there's also an op-ed that I did for the Washington publication The Hill, which you can also see on our website. And we have a video, in fact, on this.
That's at capitalresearch.org. That's our show for this week. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll join us. If you're not already, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and follow us on social media at Capital Research Center on Facebook and YouTube, and at Capital Research on Twitter.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum.
And I'm Jake Klein. Thanks for listening.